US and Russian leaders speak but reach no breakthrough on Ukraine. So is diplomacy reaching a dead end? Why is the crisis proving so hard to solve? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan in Doha. Now, the latest diplomatic attempt between the United States and Russia to resolve tensions over Ukraine has achieved apparently nothing. Presidents Putin and Biden exchanged warnings and concerns over the phone, but little else. Meanwhile, military activity continues on both sides. Moscow has been massing troops in Russia and Belarus near the border with Ukraine. And the build-up is raising fears an invasion is imminent. Ukraine is receiving Western support. Its biggest ally, the US, is sending $200 million worth of military aid, including armour-penetrating missiles and ammunition. The French presidency says Russia's given no indication of an invasion of Ukraine. That came out of a conversation between the French and Russian presidents. Emmanuel Macron spoke again with Vladimir Putin by phone on Saturday after his visit to Moscow last week. Putin told Macron NATO members had failed to respond to Russia's security demands. Macron has also been in touch with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to promote stability in Europe. More countries are telling their citizens in Ukraine to leave immediately. Australia has evacuated staff from its embassy in Kiev. The United States warned it will not evacuate anyone if war broke out and has reduced its diplomatic mission. Britain and Canada are doing the same. Ukraine called those moves premature, though. All right, let's bring in our guests into the show. We have joining us from Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer. He's a defense and military analyst and a columnist at Novaya Gazeta. In Chicago, Matthew Bryza is senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former diplomat and national security official at the White House. And in Oslo, Glenn Deason is professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway and editor of Russia in Global Affairs. Welcome to you all. If I could start then with Pavel. Does the outcome of the latest Biden-Putin phone call indicate that perhaps diplomacy is heading towards a dead end?
Well, apparently there was no serious progress there. It was, of course, a number of phone calls. There was also Secretary Blinken talking to Lavrov and the American Defense Secretary talking to Shoigu, and also General Gerasimov, Chief of General Staff, talking to General Milley. So there's a flurry of phone calls, also involving the French president, the British were also involved. And up to now, no big progress happening, but of course it's better to talk than not to talk. But the situation is extremely tense and getting worse, and the only good news most likely is that it will be somehow resolved in a week or two, because the present very high state of readiness cannot continue indefinitely.
Pavel, tell me why you think it might be resolved in a week or two in particular.
Well, I say the super high state of readiness of the Russian military cannot continue indefinitely. They'll have to step down or go into action. And there have been movements of equipment for a long distance from the Far East to the Polish border, from the Far East to the Mediterranean, from the northern seas to, again, Black Sea and Mediterranean. So these ships will have to return, these troops will have to return, everyone will have to step down in several weeks, maybe in March for sure. So a decision should come technically much earlier. Okay. It's touch or go. It's either go or it's a stand down coming up.
All right, Matthew, step down or step out or step up, but something's got to happen. But apparently not on the diplomatic front. Was the Biden-Putin phone call perhaps one of the last shots for diplomacy?
Well, it depends on how you look at diplomacy. I mean, because war is the continuation of politics by other means, we always have to keep in mind that the objective, in this case, of the one who's provoked the conference, the crisis, President Putin, is political. So his political goals, as we can clearly see now, are to prevent Ukraine from ever joining NATO, to destabilizing Ukraine, but also, in the bigger sense, it's to push back NATO's influence in Eastern Europe and restore a sense of Russian greatness in Europe. So those are political goals. And President Putin has chosen to use the threat of military force and the threat of a full-scale invasion to pursue those goals through diplomacy. Diplomacy is happening. And so President Putin has not chosen yet to employ these massive capabilities that he has deployed. And so I would argue that diplomacy has succeeded so far in deterring President Putin from invading Ukraine again. And diplomacy has succeeded precisely because NATO has maintained a united front and has said the costs of an invasion, of another invasion, will be high, will be painful. You don't want to do this. And I think that has given President Putin pause. Had there been no united front, as under the Obama administration of NATO, had there been no clear sign of high cost that would be imposed for an invasion of Crimea and of Donbass, in this case, we would have seen the troop movements already by Russia. What will happen in the next couple of weeks? That's going to be up to President Putin.
That's interesting.
And whether he
Let me jump in here then,
the
Matthew, and ask Pavel to comment on that. Do you agree with that analysis, Pavel, that had it not been for the united front demonstrated by the US and its allies, that perhaps we would have already seen a Russian invasion of Ukraine or further Russian invasion of Ukraine now?
Well, maybe. We don't know. I mean, it's like, in the summer of 1914, before the war began, there was lots of diplomacy and phone calls, and you could say that the phone calls prevented the war, but actually they didn't. So saying we should have to, see a real step down of forces before we can actually talk about the success of diplomacy.
Right. All right. Matthew, yes. I interrupted you, so I'm going to let you finish your thought before we bring in Glenn.
Thanks, Sami. So I was just saying that, what will happen in the next few weeks depends upon whether or not NATO is able to maintain this united stance, this solidarity in demonstrating how high the costs could be of an invasion, of a reinvasion. And so, I'm a little bit concerned that in recent days, it's become clear that many of the U.S.'s European allies are saying they're not in favor of the most severe economic countermeasures, such as unplugging Russia from SWIFT, from the international electronic payment system. I think President Putin is looking at that as a sign that he can turn up the pressure and play on the fear that Germany and France and other big NATO member states have of another war in Europe. President Putin is really effective at using the threat of force to frighten the U.S.'s European allies.
Now, all of this is coming after a period of intense diplomacy lately, Glenn. We've had Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, Antony Blinken, all visiting Kiev or Moscow, or perhaps even both. What has it achieved so far for sure? I mean, we're kind of talking already about, has it achieved stopping an invasion that might have already taken place? What do we know it has achieved for sure so far?
Well, I think something obviously has been achieved with these discussions. Again, for Russia, the main objective is twofold. First, to resolve the internal crisis in Ukraine, which means it has to pressure the West to push Ukraine towards actually abiding by the Minsk II agreements. So again, Kyiv promised that it would engage with Donbass and granted some autonomy. The U.S. has not pushed Ukraine to abide by this agreement. Instead, they're pumping in weapons, which could enable Kyiv to take back this region by force. So this is one of the things Russia's attempting to deter and also pressure the West to actually follow through with this agreement. The second is on the regional level, which is pan-European security. As we know, throughout the 1990s, all the OSCE partners agreed to the principle of indivisible security. So one side shouldn't expand their security at the expense of other. But again, during those days, we could ignore it because Russia was weak. But now, obviously, Russia's not weak anymore. and is demanding very clear security guarantees that, well, effectively us in NATO abides by the agreements that we have signed. So I think that given that we're actually talking about this, which we haven't done at all over many years, it suggests that there's already some progress. But otherwise, I would disagree to some extent with the former person speaking here, because I think the fact that NATO is not united, I think that's actually can be a positive thing, because we see that a lot of the continental Europeans are telling the Russians that, well, maybe we can come to an agreement. Maybe we can, push Ukraine to abide by this agreement. Maybe we can have pan-European security deals. And this is, I think, what's preventing war from happening, because Russia obviously has a lot to lose from an invasion. It doesn't want to use force, but it has red lines. And at the moment, so far, I would say France, Germany, the fact that these countries are not pushing or following the US line on this, I think that's actually, preventing war from occurring.
Interesting. Some of your comments make us think back to 1962. And of course, this is not the first time we've seen the US in a position of trying to convince Russia to back down in a military confrontation. At the height of the Cold War, you'll recall the Cuban Missile Crisis, President John Kennedy he was urged by his advisors to invade Cuba after the discovery of Soviet nuclear missile installations there. But Kennedy rejected that in what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at the beginning of the 13-day standoff, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent Soviet reinforcements and demanded Moscow remove the weapons. Kennedy then warned Cuba's leader, Fidel Castro, of the dangers his people were facing, the prospect of airstrikes to destroy the sites, followed by an invasion that could lead to the deaths of thousands. Now, while war seemed inevitable at one point, Kennedy's choice of diplomatic pressure over military action eventually brought both sides together to make concessions, saving both countries and the rest of the world from all-out nuclear war. Now, I'm wondering, when we look back at that, Pavel, why is it proving so hard this time to have that kind of deal between the two sides, where they come to some understanding to pull back forces from areas close to each other's borders?
Well, there it also didn't happen in a fortnight. It was a process of threats and counter-threats, and in the end, the sides decided to step down from the brink. Of course, there was another similar crisis. That's in '73, in the end of the Arab-Israeli War, when Russia was prepared. There were several hours left before a number of Russian airborne divisions should have landed in Egypt, together with nuclear weapons, to fight the Israelis, and the Americans lifted the DEFCON level and decided to also send the same 82 division airborne that's now deploying in Poland, was prepared to deploy to Israel to fight the Russians. And there was Kissinger having this shuttle diplomacy that more or less secured an agreement that was holding for a long time, like in the Cuban crisis. There was an agreement that actually was standing there for decades after it was reached. That's what we should be looking now for, not just simply as a kind of tactical de-escalation for several weeks or several months, but for an agreement that will actually prevent this particular crisis from recreating somewhere in the summer. You need someone who's going to be working on such an agreement. There should be effective shuttle diplomacy. Well, President Macron tried to do that. Apparently, he's not well equipped for it, because France can't pressurize no one, even Ukraine, into doing what Ukraine does not want to do. And can't pressurize Russia and can't pressurize the United States. So you need someone who can extend
That's an important
pressure
point. That's an important point. Pavel, let me
compromise.
jump in here, because that's kind of related to what Glenn was saying a moment ago. And let me take this question then to Glenn and say, is the world perhaps today a different place than in 1962 or during the Arab-Israeli conflicts, where, as you've been saying, Glenn, basically NATO isn't as united as it was before, and also perhaps Russia is not as strong as it was during the peak of the Cold War under the days of the Soviet Union? Is there perhaps less of an incentive because of that situation for both sides to quickly reach a resolution?
Well, obviously, I mean, at the moment, Russia is obviously much weaker than what the Soviet Union was. But that also means that in Europe, this threat of Russia is not as severe as it used to be. So this idea that Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union or invade Western Europe, it's this country will be taken that seriously, and you also see by the expenditure. The military expenditures of the Europeans, they don't spend that much on weapons simply because they don't see Russia being this big of a threat. And also there's more empathy now towards this idea of Russia that of course they also have the right for security, and if they're denied security, then they will have to respond in a way which undermines the security of the Europeans. So,
Matthew, let me jump in there and say, would perhaps Ukrainians have a different perspective who've seen, of course, the eastern part of their country and Donbass go through an invasion, what they would see as a Russian invasion?
Well, I think that many in Ukraine see the countries to be somewhat of a bit of a pawn, because we keep saying that the US supports Ukraine. But let's be honest, what happened when NATO offered Ukraine NATO future membership in 2008, only 20% of Ukrainians wanted it. They had a free and open election where they elected Yanukovych, who put it into law that Ukraine should be an independent country. He was removed in a coup, which did not have democratic support. And thereafter, they have been, feared to become like a staging ground for the U.S. Aggression against Russia. So I think many in Ukraine see themselves as being effectively, used as a pawn between the U.S. and Russia. So I do think that some of this analogy, of course, works. But in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is obviously reversed, because this time,
All right, let me give Matthew a chance. Matthew was looking to get in there, so go ahead.
Yeah. I think that the point you made, Sami, earlier about during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy decided not to use force and not to follow up on those who were threatening to use force is actually completely inappropriate here. It is Vladimir Putin that is threatening to use force. He is threatening to kill tens of thousands of people based on a false interpretation, a lie about NATO threatening Russia. How in the world in this crisis is NATO threatening Russia? Is when the United States and its allies send troops to NATO member states to say, if Russia moves into our countries, we will respond militarily. But as Biden has said, if Putin again invades Ukraine, we will respond not with a single soldier on the ground, but with economic sanctions. How is that the threat to use force? In addition, in countries...
Let me jump in as I play devil's advocate here, Matthew, and flip the hat now and look at things from the Russian perspective. Could they not see things from the same perspective that the US saw things in 1962 and say, well, by virtue of considering to admit Ukraine into NATO, that would allow NATO forces to be much too close to the Russian heartland?
No, of course not, because Russia has already agreed that both not only in the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, but in subsequent agreements to which Mr. Deason referred, that it will not threaten to use military force against any European or OSCE member state. Assembling 130,000 troops surrounding an OSCE member state on three sides, that is clearly a violation of that 1975 commitment that was subsequently reflected in many other of international commitments of Russia, not to mention the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, when Russia pledged to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. So President Putin knows that Russia is a defensive alliance. It has only called into force Article 5, which calls for collective defense, in one instance, after the United States was attacked on September 11th. NATO has no plans, no doctrine, no operational plans to attack Russian forces anywhere outside of NATO's own space. So this is a canard. These are Russian Kremlin talking points that the NATO is violating these international agreements, that Russia is in sharp breach of, and that there's any threat to use force against Russia. There is a threat to use force for self-defense of NATO, not to attack Russia on Russian territory.
All right, let's turn things around, go to Pavel in Moscow. Pavel, you said maybe a week or two. If war doesn't break out, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of this diplomatic crisis, does it? Will we witness a period of perhaps escalating diplomatic and military tensions and perhaps all around the world?
Yes, we're seeing that happening right now. I mean, actually last year there was massive Russian exercises, and there was a landing of up to 10,000 men in 2 hours from air and sea, but it happened not on Ukrainian territory, but in Crimea, so that was a dry run. Now we're again more or less in the same waters, and it's already much bigger than Ukraine, and that's the message coming from Moscow, that this is a serious security crisis, and it's more important. And we just saw several hours ago there was an incident close to the Kuril Islands when apparently an American submarine and a Russian anti-submarine frigate came at, apparently maybe even 2 shots, maybe not. It's not clear, but maybe the bombs were dropped. And of course, Russia is running right now a massive exercise in the Sea of Okhotsk. And the Sea of Okhotsk is a so-called bastion or a fortress where Russia hides its strategic nuclear submarines, from where they can shoot intercontinental missiles at America. And they have to defend them against American attack submarines. And also there's a standoff developing between American and NATO allied aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean, and a big Russian naval force gathering there. So there can be, outside of Ukraine, there's no Ukrainians in the Pacific and no Ukrainian forces in the Mediterranean, but there could be actually skirmishes between in the air and on the sea and under the sea, between directly American and Russian military, which could lead to a global war, maybe nuclear war, very quickly.
All right, I can see.
And there should be some way to diffuse this and find a kind of quid pro quo.
I think everyone would agree on that last bit. There should be a way to diffuse it. I think we've got a brief minute left. Let me give it, if I may, to Glenn. And Glenn, looking at the big picture of all this, is this a readjustment of the balance of power, since the strength and the unity of both what was the Soviet Union, today Russia, and on the West, on the other hand, that balance of power is different today?
Obviously, and I think that's what we're seeing now. It's an adjustment, because the unipolar order already came to an end, and there's efforts now to adjust to this multipolar system. And this transition has not been done properly yet. And this is also some of the explains a lot of the actions by the United States. So, for example,
just briefly, then, is that cause for us to be optimistic that humanity will not annihilate itself?
No, not necessarily. Use the analogy of or the historical analogy of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you have to remember that at that point, Kennedy, they kept it a secret to the American public that they actually made a compromise with the Soviets. So there's not always this idea that the compromise is seen as a weakness or appeasement, as we hear every time someone suggests a compromise with Russia. I think, it gives reason for being very pessimistic. But again, I think more countries now, especially Germany and France, are starting to realize that, there's some compromise will have to be found in order to avoid a catastrophe. Because again, for Russia, this is seen as a red line which they can't back away from. So there has to be some change in the mentality, because this order we had for the past 30 years, where the West simply dictates and nothing Russia can do, I think it's painful for the West to accept that this era has come to an end. But I think this makes compromise all the more difficult as well.
All right. It's been a great discussion. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Let's thank our guests very much for their contributions, Pavel, Matthew, and Glenn. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here in Doha, for now, it's goodbye.